Okay, we're going to try this again, and I'm going to do this at a lower voice without my AirPods in. I had recorded this earlier today. Actually, I had just finished it, but for some reason there was no sound. So I got to redo it. But people here are trying to sleep, so I'm going to keep my voice somewhat low. We're going to be talking about impeachment today. Now, when I say impeachment, you probably think of Trump. We're not going to talk about Trump. You probably think of Bill Clinton. We're not going to talk about Bill Clinton. You probably think of Nixon. Well, President Nixon wasn't actually impeached. He had articles of impeachment brought against him and then he resigned. But if you want to be an annoying student like I was, Judge Vincent Nixon was impeached and removed. So if a teacher, if you're younger, and a teacher ever tells you Nixon wasn't impeached, you can just pull a little swerve on them and say that no, Nixon was impeached and removed. But you'd be talking about Judge Walter Nixon. Just a little piece of history here. But we're going to be talking about the first presidential impeachment, and that was of Andrew Johnson in 1868. But before I go into it, I need to talk a little bit of history and just clear up some terms. A lot of people believe that the term impeachment means to remove from office. It does not. It means to accuse somebody of high crimes and misdemeanors which could lead to their removal from office. Think of it like this. An impeachment is like a arrest. Now, you've been accused, but you haven't been found responsible yet. Removal from office comes after impeachment. So, we just got that out of the way. I also want to talk about the term Democrat and Republican. I know we live in a very torn society right now where it's very tribalistic. The Republicans of the 1860s and the Democrats of the 1860s are not identical or very much alike to what you would consider the Republicans and Democrats of today. So because of that, when I talk about them, don't think I'm talking about your tribe, so on and so forth. Also, how nominees were chosen for political parties was also very different. Now we have the primary and caucus system, which is a little different for each party, but the people have something to do with it. Back then, no. They would go to the Democratic convention and the Republican convention, which they still have today, but they're really just shows. They're really just, ways to try to sell the candidate. Back then, no. Back then, they were ways to choose the candidate in backroom deals, cigars, so on and so forth. So let's talk about the 1860 Republican National Convention. Abraham Lincoln showed up as a delegate to vote to try to figure out who would be the nominee. He did not attend with the intention of becoming the nominee. However, he was a compromise candidate. There were two candidates who just wouldn't give in, and you need a majority, not a plurality. Difference being is majority, you need 50% plus one. A plurality, you just need more than anybody else. And nobody would give up their votes to the other side until Lincoln came along and everyone threw their votes behind Lincoln. He did not attend expecting to be the nominee. The same situation happened with vice president. And Lincoln's vice president ended up being a gentleman by the name of Hannibal Hamlin. Now, if that's not a cool name, I don't know what is. And they ran as the Republican ticket in 1860. It was the Lincoln-Hamlin ticket. And they were abolitionists, because at that point Lincoln had become an abolitionist. He was not always. I can do a long form on Lincoln at some point if people would like. Hamlin was, and they won. Throughout the next 4 years, bloody civil war, bloodiest war in the history of America, brother against brother, families divided, just awfulness. I'm not a fan of war, as you can tell. And the South had seceded. Now, the Republicans were abolitionists and unionists, while the Democrats were secessionists and anti-abolitionists, with the exception of one Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson, who was the governor of Tennessee, although after secession they referred to them as honorary presidents, I believe, of the seceded nations, or seceded nation, but they called themselves nation. Terminology, who cares? He was vastly racist and an anti-abolitionist, but he was pro-union. Turn around, it becomes 1864, and it's time for Lincoln to run for re-election. Now, a common misconception in history is that Lincoln ran in 1864 under the Republican Party. He did not. He ran under the American Union Party, which you've probably never heard of. Why haven't you heard of it? I'm happy you asked. You haven't heard of it because it's a historical fiction. It didn't exist. It wasn't real. Because Lincoln, although history has sort of switched itself into making people think that he was this popular president at the time, he really thought he could lose. So he wanted to run with a Democrat on his ticket, and he was going to sandbag Hannibal Hamlin. And that was his prerogative. And who did he choose? What he believed was the least of all the evils. And that was Andrew Johnson. Because although Andrew Johnson was an anti-abolitionist, he wanted to restore the Union. He wanted America to be one country. He didn't like there being the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. So, the Republican Party would not let Lincoln run with a Democrat, and the Democrats wouldn't let Johnson run on a Republican ticket. So Lincoln created the American Union Party just to run as. Wasn't a real thing. Didn't really exist. It was a historical fiction, just so they could run together. And Lincoln at that point believed he would be guaranteed victory. And he was right. He was guaranteed victory. And 5 weeks later, he had a bullet in the back of his head. And he died the next morning. This happened at the Ford's Theater. Very interesting story of what led up to the Lincoln assassination, but that's another long form. But now, the country is in this really weird situation where they just elected a Republican president and now they have a Democratic president. Well, ain't that a situation? Now, the Republican Party at the time was broken into two. There was I guess you would call them softer Republicans, who just wanted to welcome the Confederacy back into the Union with open arms, like, we'll give you an olive branch. I believe that's what Lincoln would have fallen under. And then there was the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans wanted to make the South suffer before they joined back into the Union. They wanted to do they wanted to make them hurt as much as they made the former slaves hurt. They were wrathful. They wanted revenge. So, we have a situation which we did not expect to get into. Just to rewind a little bit, the day Johnson was inaugurated as vice president, Hannibal Hamlin got him wasted. And by wasted, I mean blackout drunk. Because he was jealous. He thought that he should remain vice president, and he had it stripped away from him. And at that point, the inaugurations happened in March. They happened in January now. And the newly elected vice president and the newly elected president, although Lincoln was extending his term, he was reelected, it was a new term, they both would give speeches. If you notice, that tradition doesn't exist anymore. That's because Johnson made an absolute fool of himself. He could barely get a word out, and he vomited while giving his vice presidential inaugural speech. And 5 weeks later, he would become president of the United States. And when he became president, he said he would honor Lincoln by keeping his cabinet. But Johnson was not a likable man. A, he was drunk half the time. B, he didn't really know much about politics. And C, he stood for everything the radical Republicans stood against. Tensions were about to boil over. Now, Lincoln had said before he died, when you beat a man, you let him up easily. This was not the philosophy Johnson took. Although he was a Southerner, he wanted them to, go through their fair amount of suffering as they came up. But not nearly as much as one of the most interesting members of history, and somebody who does not get his just desserts, named Thaddeus Stevens. He was a Northerner, and he was the radical Republican, and he wanted the South to suffer. That whole letting him up easy thing, GTFO. Now, I know that currently liberals sometimes have a reputation of being soft, snowflakes, whatever terminology you want to use. Not this guy. His picture in Wikipedia scares me. He did not have an ailment that prevented him from walking normal, but he walked with a scary cane. So, So Johnson had appointed new congressmen because at that point Congress, the Senate at least, was chosen by the state legislatures. And at that point, although it wasn't really constitutional, so was the House, just to try to make it even. So when the Southern representation showed up to Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, who was not the Speaker of the House, told the Speaker of the House, who I believe at that point was Schuyler Colfax, just to not call them. Just when you take roll call, skip them over. And he was so intimidating that they just went home. They didn't argue. They didn't put up a fight. They just said, well, our names weren't called, so we're leaving. This made Andrew Johnson fuming. So how was he going to do it? He was going to take it out on the newly freed slaves in the South. Because keep in mind, Thaddeus Stevens wanted to take it out on the people who made them suffer. So Andrew Johnson was going to make them suffer. As you can see, it's about to boil over. So, with the help of Johnson, the southern states enacted what was called black codes, which forbade blacks from sitting on a jury, voting, 15th Amendment hadn't passed yet, holding office, giving testimony, even being a witness in a trial. And their labor contracts were equivalent to prison conditions, while the white people's labor contracts, easy peasy. So Johnson thought that this is how he was going to ensure a Democratic sweep of Congress in 1866. So he went on a victory tour, congratulating himself around the country. Then he actually, funny enough, tried to form the National Union Party. It never happened, but he tried. He went from state to state talking about his accomplishments, which must have been very short because he never accomplished anything. Then we have the midterms of 1866. Was Johnson successful? Would the Democrats take over? And the answer is a resounding no. The Republicans swept, probably based on loyalty to the departed Abraham Lincoln. And they had a veto-proof majority. And this led to a governmental stalemate. I can imagine these couriers. They had it down pat. A bill would be passed by Congress. They would walk to the White House. Johnson wouldn't even read it. He would veto it. It would go back to Congress, who would override it. It's happened multiple times a day. So Congress started slowly stripping away the powers of the presidency. However, something that was not in control of Congress was control of the Army. So Johnson went ahead and fired all the military officers in the South and the ones that the radical Republicans and the moderate Republicans supported, except for he wasn't allowed to fire the Major General of the Army, who was Ulysses S. Grant. Congress then changed the number of Supreme Court justices to make sure Johnson couldn't get any appointees. From 9, then one died, they changed it to 8. Then before recess, just in case one died, they changed it to 7. So I guess 9 isn't the sacred number everyone speaks of now. I digress. But the biggest power they took away, and what would lead to the ultimate impeachment, would be the Tenure in Office Act. Reconstruction at this point was a misery. They tried to impeach Johnson twice before this, and it had failed because they realized this would be the first presidential impeachment ever in the history of it. So, Thaddeus Stevens called Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in. Edwin Stanton was not liked by Lincoln or Johnson. They had that in common. But he was purposefully not liked by Lincoln because in order to have a good guy, you need a bad guy. So Stanton, being the Secretary of War, he served the purpose of bad guy. So Stevens and Stanton came up with the idea of the Tenure of Office Act. This was put into place that would prevent the president from dismissing an officer that had been previously appointed with the advice and consent of the Senate without the Senate's approval, being he, because there were no she's, holding office at that point, was appointed by the sitting president. Congress passed it, went to Johnson, who was probably on his 10th drink of the day by 11 a.m., didn't even look at it, vetoed it. It went back to Congress, and it was passed. And the veto was overridden with a 2/3 majority. Now, just a little history here. The first time a vice president ever in the history of our country broke a tie in the Senate was when the issue came up whether a cabinet member had to be could only be fired with the advice and consent of the Senate, or whether the president would be able to just fire him. So, John Adams voted, just let him fire him. And that became the law of the land until the Tenure in Office Act. So, now, Thaddeus Stevens calls up Stanton, and he says, do everything you can to piss off Andrew Johnson. Talk about his drunkenness. Do whatever you have to. Have him fire you. Because most likely, he doesn't know that he can't. So, they put their idea into place. So eventually, Johnson fired Stanton without Senate approval, which was the law at the time that Johnson probably didn't even know about. So Johnson then had to appoint, or thought he had to appoint, a new Secretary of War. First person he appointed was William Tecumseh Sherman, who said, no, I see what's going on here, no part of this. Then he tried to appoint Jacob Dolson Cox, saying, I want no part of this. Then Johnson was like, you know what? I'm a nasty son of a bee. Who's Stanton's worst enemy? It was a gentleman by the name of Lorenzo Thomas, who had a reputation of being a bumbling coward, to be the new Secretary of War. So, Lorenzo Thomas showed up at the War Department which was right next to the White House, to take over. And in one of really the funniest historical moments, Thomas presented Stanton with the paperwork of his firing and that he was the new Secretary of War. And they went back and forth for 10 minutes. Now, I've been recording this video for 25 minutes and 19 seconds, where they would go back and forth. I'm the Secretary of War. No, I'm the Secretary of War. No, I'm the Secretary of War. No, I'm the 10 straight minutes of that. I don't know. That's embarrassing and it's funny. So Stanton eventually said, okay, you're the Secretary of War. Cool. Let me just go get my belongings. Was he actually planning on getting his belongings? No. He locked himself in. And he sent some of his lackeys to his home so his wife would bring him food. And he stayed in there throughout the entire remainder of this story. He just would not leave that building. Well, now Thaddeus Stevens had his means to impeach Andrew Johnson. So it went to a vote. And it was a complete party line vote in committee. It was 7-2. And then the House voted, I want to get these numbers here for you, 126 to 47 to impeach Andrew Johnson. And he became the first president to be impeached. But remember, as I said earlier, impeachment and removal are not the same thing. After the vote to impeach, there were 11 articles of impeachment, of which 9 were approved. Just very quickly, the first one, the most important one, was the violation of the Tenure of Office Act. The second one was appointing Lorenzo Thomas. The third one was a combination of both. The fourth one was unlawfully hindering Stanton from doing his job. The fifth one was that Johnson had conspired with Lorenzo Thomas to hinder the Tenure in Office Act. The sixth one was by violating the Tenure of Office Act, he had committed a high crime and misdemeanor. The seventh one was that by conspiring with Lorenzo Thomas by force to seize, take, and possess the property of the United States, which was legally under Stanton's control. The eighth was that Johnson had unlawfully sought to control disbursements of money for military and the Department of War by moving to remove Stanton and appoint Thomas. The ninth was that Johnson had violated the Command of Army Act, unlawfully instructing Major General William H. Emory to ignore the unconstitutional 1867 Army Appropriations Act language that all orders issued by the President and the Secretary of War relating to military operations shall go through the General of the Army. The 10th one was a catch-all, just that Johnson was mean and drunk all the time. And the 11th one was that he was drunk when he gave his inauguration speech. Now, the only one that really mattered was the first one, because if you pass one, that's all that matters. And 2 through 11 were kind of nonsense. But you get that one passed, boom, He's out of here. So, you still got Stanton locked up in the War Office, and they really thought there was going to be another civil war. I mean, the whole back and forth, it's funny in hindsight, was not funny at the time. And then the trial took place. Andrew Johnson did not appear. He didn't make physical presence at the trial, which then I believe led to the tradition that presidents don't attend their own impeachment trial. The judge was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Let me see that gentleman's name. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court under Johnson. Impeachment. Hold on 1 second. No, it was not John Roberts. That's the current one. Official duties, blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. It was Samuel Chase, a Lincoln appointee. Isn't that ironic? Okay, well, that's just an interesting little factoid that a Lincoln appointee would then be the judge over the Johnson impeachment. When it started, it was a spectacle. They were selling tickets. Imagine if they were selling tickets to the last Trump impeachment, which for some reason the judge was Senate pro tempore Patrick Henry something. It doesn't matter, but it wasn't John Roberts, and why I don't know. I'll look that up. So, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I don't wish this upon anybody, Thaddeus Stevens was supposed to be the lead prosecutor. But he got very ill. And he got very ill because his hatred for Andrew Johnson was so important to him that he neglected his bodily care and came down with a disease which was never made public, but it made his bones burn, and he couldn't stand and was always in pain. The trial took 90 days, and they were selling tickets on day one. However, it got boring fast, tempers cooled, and there was a lot of just going back and forth. So here were the issues brought on by the defense. Okay? First, Johnson didn't have a vice president, and there was really no methodology to choose one. So they thought that it would probably go to Wade. Who's Wade? Happy you asked. He was the president pro tempore of the Senate. That wasn't in the Constitution. There was no 25th Amendment at that point. But that's what they assumed. And he was a radical Republican, but like on crack. He believed in insane things like fair tariffs, women getting the right to vote. And then he was actually pushed to resign. So the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, would become the president pro tempore of the Senate and be next in line to the presidency, so Wade wouldn't. The second prosecution, I'm going to go back and forth here. The prosecution was they were worried that Johnson would become a martyr. Now, they had already determined that Grant would be their nominee, because the election was only a few months away and they had to win. So they were worried they would impeach and remove Johnson, who would then come back. I don't know if they were aware that you can't really do that, but that was a fear they had, and they did not want to make a martyr out of him. The third factor was that Johnson toned down over the course of the impeachment. He didn't come off as unlikable. He sort of changed his personality and became a nice guy. Of course, it was fake, but people believed it. And his defense was led by William Everett and Benjamin Curtis, who were just amazing attorneys at the time. And also, but his main defense was, you really couldn't get around this one, that the law was written that the president cannot fire a cabinet member appointed by the sitting president. Stanton was appointed by Lincoln, not Johnson. I don't know how they messed that up. It just seems so obvious to me. And then, the final factor, good old corruption. This was the era of Boss Tweed. There were 41,000 workers who worked under the president, and I'd like to bring in another character, Senator Edmund G. Ross, who the 35th president, John F. Kennedy, in his book Profiles of Courage, called a courageous, heroic senator in American history. Well, with all due respect to President Kennedy, I believe he was a scoundrel who took bribes. For 89 days of the trial, he claimed he would vote to remove Johnson, because every day the Republicans and the Democrats would take a tally to see where they stood. They had the votes. Johnson was done. They were going to remove him. But they only had the exact amount they needed. Not one more. So, then came the day. I believe I said it earlier, it was like May 8th, 1868. And they didn't have those little computer things, so it was a roll call vote. And you could see during the vote, Ross was sweating. And I'm not just talking because it was hot out, because it was May in D.C. and they didn't have air conditioning. I'm saying buckets coming out of his head. Because for 89 days, he said, you got my vote. This guy is outie. And then, when it came to, and keep in mind, they're only voting on the first count. You know, Edmund Ross, I vote to acquit. And Andrew Johnson was acquitted by one vote. Let me see what the exact tally was. I have it in my mind, but I don't want to, I could easily be wrong by like one or two, and I don't want to. Yep, 35-19. 35-19. When they thought they had 36-18. Now, nobody actually saw Ross take a bribe, but the math really ain't math in that he didn't. Because Johnson became Edmund Ross's, for lack of a better word, bitch afterwards. Whatever Ross said went. Now, at that point, like the current day Koch brothers or George Soros, was a man named Perry Fuller. Huge criminal. Ross had Johnson appoint him head of the IRS, who treated it like his personal piggy bank. It was his money. He would just choose people who didn't have to pay taxes, and he would choose people who had to pay quadruple taxes. He just didn't care. And in the meantime, he, took 30 million by himself. And that's 30 million in 1868 standards, which, when I recorded this earlier, be about 700 million today, just in his pocket. Johnson felt vindicated. Johnson was the man. Johnson was going to be the president for life. Not so fast, Andy. Because then comes the election of 1868. While Andrew Johnson shows up at the Democratic National Convention, expecting, it just went without saying, he would get the nomination. He was the sitting president. And come on now. And this occurred in New York City. And he got one vote. His own. One vote. People were done with him. They had chosen the Democratic Party, decided to nominate Horatio Seymour, who was your run-of-the-mill racist, anti-abolitionist Democrat, and Ulysses S. Grant absolutely destroyed him. 214 electoral votes to 80, 26 states to 8, popular vote of 3,013,421 to 2,706,829. Andrew Johnson wasn't even there. He was an afterthought. After the impeachment, it affected Thaddeus Stevens so much. I believe he died a few days later. Let me get his exact date of death here. No, not a few days. It's like a few months. He died August 11th, 1868. But he could just never come back from the fact that Johnson beat him. And what happened to Edwin Stanton? This might be one of the saddest parts of the whole story. Edwin Stanton had one dream his whole life, and that was to be a Supreme Court justice. He was the Secretary of War. He did everything he was told to do, but that was his goal. He wanted to sit on the Supreme Court, and he almost had that opportunity. In 1869, President Ulysses Grant appointed him to the Supreme Court. While he was having his confirmation hearing, he died. He never made it to the Supreme Court. They had an honorary vote, and he actually died on his birthday, on December 19th, 1868. It's just a sad part of the story. So, that's the story. That's what you get. That's the story of the first impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Really, there are no winners. But that's what set in place what would later become the tradition for impeachment. Again, I just scratched the surface. I suggest you study it, and you can always pull that Nixon was impeached and removed. It was just a different Nixon. Hopefully you learned something. If not, you'll learn something next time. Have a good night.